If you'd asked me 6 months ago if I trusted my wife, Sarah, I would have said yes, without hesitation. I always believed in the foundation of our marriage: honesty, loyalty, and openness. We'd been married for 10 years, shared everything, and still laughed like teenagers about silly things. But there was a nagging feeling, an instinct I couldn't shake, and it started when she began taking these so-called girls' trips. Sarah and her group of friends had always been close, but in the last year or so, the frequency of these weekend getaways had increased. At first, it seemed innocent enough. I mean, she deserved time with her friends, right? They were always posting about it on social media: group selfies, spa days, wine glasses clinking in sunset light. It looked like fun. But as time went on, things started to feel off. It was small things at first, details she either glossed over or avoided mentioning altogether. When she got back from the trips, she was either distracted or oddly distant, like her mind was still somewhere else. And then there were her responses to simple questions about her trips: short, vague, lacking the usual enthusiasm. I pushed these thoughts aside, telling myself I was overreacting. But there's only so long you can ignore your instincts before they start gnawing at you. The real crack appeared one night, about a month after her latest girls' trip. Sarah had gone to bed early, and I stayed up, scrolling through the TV channels with nothing catching my interest. Her phone, charging on the coffee table beside me, buzzed with a message. I don't usually go through her phone, I never had a reason to. But something about the message notification grabbed my attention. It was from a contact named Emily, one of her closest friends and a frequent girls' trip companion. I wouldn't have thought twice if it was just Emily sending a random message. But this text, even on the lock screen, looked strange. Asterisk, hey, do you think Mark suspects anything? Asterisk. My heart froze. I stared at the message, trying to make sense of it. Who was Mark? And why would he be suspicious? I had to fight the urge to unlock her phone right then and there to read the rest. But I knew Sarah's passcode, and with her upstairs asleep, it felt like fate had dropped a clue right into my lap. As much as it felt wrong to snoop, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on than she was telling me. I unlocked her phone and pulled up the conversation with Emily, scrolling up to find that the messages from the past several days were gone. The thread only contained a few stray messages, as if someone had scrubbed it clean. That's when I realized Sarah must have been deleting messages. With my heart racing, I scrolled through her other recent texts. Most of the conversations were benign, typical exchanges with family and co-workers. But then I found another thread, with a number saved under Jenny, a name I didn't recognize. The thread was full of flirtatious messages, clearly between Sarah and another man. My stomach turned as I read them, each message peeling back another layer of betrayal. Words she used to say to me, promises she used to make to me, they were all there, only meant for someone else. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, unable to sleep, my mind whirling with questions and anger. Who was he? Was it someone from work? Was it someone from these so-called girls' trips? I couldn't confront her without more evidence, and yet the anger boiled inside me, pushing me closer to the edge. The next morning, Sarah came downstairs, cheerful and blissfully unaware of my sleepless night. She kissed me on the cheek as if everything was fine. I played along, for now, asking her innocently about her plans for the day and listening to her usual responses. But inside, a part of me knew everything had changed. Over the next few days, I became a detective in my own marriage. I watched, I listened, and I waited. Each day, a bit more of her facade cracked, and each day, I felt the weight of what I was discovering crushing down on me. Chapter 2, the pieces start falling into place. The following days felt surreal. I found myself oscillating between disbelief, anger, and a strange numbness that crept in when the emotions became too much. During the day, I went through the motions: work, errands, and small talk with Sarah, but my mind was preoccupied, picking over every detail from our past few years, looking for signs I might have missed. My instincts told me to gather more evidence before I confronted her, and so, I waited and observed. I became hyper-aware of everything she did and said. She was still taking her girls' trips every month or so, and I noticed she was careful with her words whenever she spoke about them. She never mentioned specific details, and her stories seemed overly rehearsed. My mind spun with questions I couldn't ask directly without tipping her off. So I decided to take a different approach. I called Emily. Emily and I had known each other for years through Sarah. She had always been warm and friendly, and I'd thought of her as a genuine friend. If Sarah was lying, I figured Emily might be, too, but there was a chance Emily didn't know anything about the affair, or that she'd slip up and reveal something. With my heart racing, I called her up one evening, under the guise of asking about an upcoming barbecue she'd invited us to. We chatted for a bit, exchanging small talk, before I brought up Sarah's recent trips. "Hey, you and Sarah have been getting a lot of girls' time lately," I said, keeping my tone light. "Must be nice to get away from all of us boring husbands, huh?" There was a pause on the other end, just a second too long to be normal, but Emily quickly recovered. "Oh, yeah. It's been fun," she said, but her voice sounded strained, as though she was choosing her words carefully. "You know, just wine, shopping, and catching up." I could almost feel her discomfort through the phone, and I tried to press a little further. "Sarah always says you guys have the best stories from those trips," I said, hoping she'd fill in some details. "Anything interesting happen last time?" Another pause. "Not much, really. Just the usual, spas and wine. You know how it is." Her answer was even vaguer than Sarah's had been, and something about the way she said usual made me feel that it was anything but. After I hung up, my suspicions grew tenfold. I spent the next few days digging further, checking our credit card statements, looking for hotel receipts or anything that might point to where she'd really been. I wasn't proud of this invasion of her privacy, but I needed to know the truth. I couldn't live in this limbo, suspecting without any concrete evidence. Then, I found something unexpected. One night, I decided to search our shared laptop for any traces of messages or hidden files. Sarah was usually meticulous about erasing her digital footprints, at least, so far as I could tell from her phone, but it seemed she'd overlooked one small detail. In the browser's search history, I found recent searches for hotels in Miami. This didn't match up with her last girls' trip, which she'd claimed was in Asheville. The searches continued, leading me to several sites that hinted at couples packages and romantic getaways, each with dates that corresponded to her trips. My heart pounded as I scrolled through the search history, each entry confirming what I had feared. Miami. Private dinners. Beach cabanas. She hadn't just been with her friends, she'd been with him. I knew I couldn't confront her yet, not without knowing the full story. Part of me wanted to storm into the bedroom, demand answers, and vent all the anger that had been building up inside me. But I also wanted her to confess, to come clean and tell me the truth. So I waited. I spent sleepless nights on the couch, planning my next steps and rehearsing what I'd say. But as much as I wanted her to admit to the affair, I also feared it. I feared hearing her confirm the betrayal that had already fractured the foundation of our marriage. Then, on a cold Thursday night, she mentioned she'd be leaving again that weekend, this time for a quick girls' getaway. The words were almost casual, like she was asking me to pick up milk on my way home. But I could tell there was more to it. She didn't meet my eyes as she spoke, and her hands were fidgeting in a way they never did when she was calm. "Where are you headed this time?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She paused, then forced a smile. "The girls wanted to check out a new winery in Napa," she said, her voice sounding too rehearsed. "You know how much Emily loves her wine." I nodded, playing along, but I knew this was my chance. I had to find out if this girl's trip was really what she claimed it to be. Chapter 3, Following the Lies. As Sarah packed her bags the next morning, I watched her carefully, feeling more like a stranger in my own home than ever before. She was meticulous, folding each item with care, checking her phone occasionally, no doubt waiting for a message from him. I wondered if she even noticed how distant I'd been, how tightly I was wound up beneath my calm facade. "Have fun in Napa," I said as she zipped up her bag. She smiled and nodded, giving me a quick kiss before heading out the door, leaving the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. As soon as the door clicked shut, I felt a surge of determination. I'd made up my mind to follow her. It was a drastic step, something I'd never imagined myself doing, but I couldn't take another minute of doubt, wondering where she was and who she was really with. I waited about half an hour to avoid suspicion, then grabbed my keys and headed for the car. Tracking her was easier than I thought. I'd enabled location sharing on our phones years ago when she'd been traveling for work, in case of emergencies. I hadn't thought about it in ages, but now it was my lifeline. As I drove, watching her little dot on the screen, I was struck by the absurdity of the situation. This was my wife. The person I'd trusted most in the world. Her location was already shifting from Napa. She was headed south straight toward Miami. The drive was long, each mile giving me too much time to think, to stew in the bitterness and betrayal. By the time I pulled into the city, I could see on the app that she'd stopped at a hotel on South Beach, an upscale place I'd always dreamed of taking her to one day. The irony was painful. I parked a few blocks away and approached the hotel on foot, careful to stay out of sight. My heart pounded as I waited, watching the lobby entrance from behind a row of palm trees. And then I saw her. She was standing there, looking beautiful in a flowy dress that caught the breeze, her hair falling in waves around her shoulders. I watched her scan the crowd, her eyes lighting up as a man approached her, a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, sharply dressed, and when he reached her, he wrapped her in an embrace that was far too familiar, far too intimate. I could see them laughing together, leaning in close, their faces inches apart. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. They headed inside together, and I stood there, frozen, torn between the urge to charge in after them and the realization that I'd seen all I needed to see. The truth was in front of me, undeniable, and yet I couldn't look away. I waited, leaning against a palm tree as waves of emotions crashed over me, each one harsher than the last. The reality of the situation hit me hard. Sarah wasn't on a girls' trip, she was in Miami with another man, living a double life I'd never suspected. I imagined them in a suite together, sharing secrets, plans, and laughs that should have been ours. The betrayal sank in deeper with each passing second, and the trust I'd built over the years unraveled like a frayed rope. Finally, I turned and walked back to my car, barely feeling the ground beneath my feet. The drive back was a blur, my mind racing as I played out every conversation we'd ever had about these trips, every little sign I'd ignored, every lie she'd spun so seamlessly. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, saw her face light up in a way that used to be reserved for me. By the time she returned home, I had made up my mind. When she walked in, looking fresh and carefree, I felt a wave of anger unlike anything I'd ever experienced. She set her bag down, looked up, and her smile faded when she saw me standing there, waiting. "Hey," she said, a slight frown appearing on her face. "Why are you up so early?" I looked her straight in the eye, refusing to flinch. "How was Miami?" Her face paled, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for something to say. For once, she didn't have a rehearsed response. I pressed on, my voice cold. "You went to Miami, didn't you? Not Napa. Not with Emily. With someone else." Her silence confirmed everything. She looked down, unable to meet my gaze, and I could see the guilt weighing heavily on her. Finally, she nodded, barely a whisper escaping her lips. "I'm sorry. Sorry." The word felt hollow, inadequate, like a weak bandage on a wound too deep to heal. The months of betrayal, the lies, the nights spent wondering if I was going crazy, every painful moment came crashing down. I wanted to yell, to demand answers, to know why she'd thrown our marriage away for someone else. But as I looked at her, I realized nothing she could say would make this better. There were no words left. Chapter 4, Confronting the Silence. The silence between us was unbearable. It stretched on, thick and suffocating, filling the room with an unspoken tension. Sarah still hadn't looked up. She was fidgeting, twisting her wedding ring on her finger, a nervous habit I'd seen 100 times but had never understood the way I did now. She was grasping at the symbol of our marriage, a symbol that suddenly felt meaningless. "I need you to explain," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" She hesitated, still looking anywhere but at me. Finally, she sank down onto the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she murmured. "I don't even know where to start." "Start with him," I said, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "Who is he? How long has this been going on?" She swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the floor. "His name is Matt. I met him at a conference last year. He was a colleague, just someone I was working with. But then, one thing led to another, and," her voice trailed off as if she couldn't bring herself to finish. I could feel my jaw tighten, my fists clenching as I struggled to keep my composure. "How long, Sarah? How long have you been lying to me?" "About 6 months, she said, her voice barely a whisper. 6 months. Half a year of deceit, of coming home to me every day with that same gentle smile, that same casual warmth, all while she was lying to my face. I felt a wave of nausea, the betrayal hitting me all over again. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, the words coming out sharper than I'd intended. "Why keep pretending like nothing was wrong?" She looked up at me then, her eyes wide and filled with something that looked almost like fear. "I didn't want to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. I thought maybe I could just end things with him and go back to the way things were. I didn't want to throw away everything we have, everything we built. Everything we have," I repeated, feeling a fresh wave of anger. "Sarah, you've already thrown it away. You threw it away the moment you decided to keep lying to me, to keep sneaking off on your girls' trips while you were really with him." She flinched at my words, her hands twisting anxiously in her lap. "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I know, and I'm so sorry. I never wanted it to be like this. I don't know what happened. It just got out of control." There it was, the classic excuse. It got out of control. As if this was some random accident, a mistake she could shrug off. I felt my patience slipping, the fragile hold I had on my emotions unraveling with every word she said. "What did he give you that I didn't?" I asked, my voice cold and steady, but my heart pounding. Her gaze dropped again. "It wasn't about that," she murmured, almost as if she didn't want me to hear. "It wasn't about what he gave me or what you didn't. It was. I don't know, I just felt something. Something I hadn't felt in a long time." I shook my head, struggling to understand. "So, what? You felt a spark with some stranger, and that was worth risking everything we had?" She sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her own choices had finally caught up with her. "No. It wasn't worth it. I know that now. But at the time, I just didn't think." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. After everything we'd been through, After years of building a life together, she'd thrown it all away on some fleeting feeling with a man she barely knew. I wanted to scream, to shake her, to make her understand the damage she'd done. But all I could do was sit there, feeling the cold reality sink in. Finally, I forced myself to ask the question that had been gnawing at me from the start. Do you love him? She looked up, her face pale, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She hesitated, and in that tiny pause, I felt my heart shatter all over again. I don't know, she said, her voice breaking. It's complicated. It's not like that. Not like that. I repeated, feeling a hollow laugh escape my lips. Sarah, you've been sneaking off to see him for 6 months. How is it not like that? She covered her face with her hands, shaking her head as if she couldn't bear to look at me. I don't know, Mark. I don't know what's wrong with me. I didn't want to hurt you. I just wanted to feel something different, something. I don't even know. For a moment, I just stared at her, trying to process the woman sitting in front of me. This wasn't the Sarah I knew, the woman I'd built a life with, the woman I'd trusted with everything I had. It felt like I was looking at a stranger, someone I couldn't recognize, couldn't reach. And in that moment, I realized that there was no going back. No apology, no excuse, no tearful confession could change what had happened. The trust we'd built over the years was gone, shattered into 1,000 pieces, and I didn't know if I could ever put it back together. I stood up slowly, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. She looked up, her eyes wide with fear, as if she knew what was coming. I need time, I said quietly, barely able to look at her. I need time to figure out what I want, because right now, I don't even know if I can look at you. She reached out, grabbing my hand, but I pulled away, the touch feeling foreign and wrong. Please, Mark, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Please, I'll do anything. Just, give me a chance to make it right. But I didn't answer. I couldn't. I turned and walked out of the room, the sound of her quiet sobs following me as I closed the door. And as I stood there, alone in the silence, I realized that the life we'd built was over. Whether or not we found a way to move forward, nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 5, The Breaking Point. I spent the next few days at a friend's place. Tom had been one of my closest friends for years, the kind of guy who'd drop everything if I needed him, and he did just that when I showed up on his doorstep at midnight. He didn't ask questions, he just handed me a beer, sat me down on his couch, and waited until I was ready to talk. When I finally told him everything, his face turned a shade of anger I'd rarely seen. He cursed, shook his head, muttering things like, I never thought Sarah would do something like this, and you deserve better, man. And I knew he was right. I had given everything to my marriage, poured my heart and soul into it, and all I had to show for it was a betrayal that left me feeling like a hollowed-out shell. The first few days were the hardest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with him, laughing, holding him close, sharing moments she should have been sharing with me. And every time I looked at my phone, I saw her missed calls and texts, each one more desperate than the last. I couldn't bring myself to respond. I didn't even read most of them. But on the third day, I finally broke down and opened one of her messages. Sarah, Mark, please, just let me explain. I know I don't deserve it, but I love you. I messed up, and I'll do whatever it takes to fix this asterisk. I stared at the words, feeling the sting of bitterness rise in my throat. I knew she was hurting, too, and maybe a part of me still loved her somewhere under all the anger and betrayal. But I didn't know if that part of me was enough to overcome what she'd done. Tom tried to help me through it, reminding me to eat, to get some air, even dragging me out for a few drinks to distract me. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the weight of Sarah's betrayal. I replayed every moment in my head, every smile, every kiss, every lie she'd told. It was like a bad movie on loop, and I couldn't switch it off. Finally, after a week of silence, I decided to meet with her. Not because I was ready to forgive her, but because I needed answers. I needed closure, one way or another. We met at a quiet coffee shop in the city, a place we'd gone to on our first date. The irony wasn't lost on me. I got there early, watching the door as I waited for her to arrive. When she walked in, looking nervous and smaller somehow, a part of me felt a pang of sadness for the life we'd once shared. But that feeling was quickly swallowed by the anger that had become my constant companion. She sat down across from me, her hands clasped tightly together. "Thank you for meeting me," she said softly, barely able to meet my eyes. I nodded, waiting for her to speak. I wasn't here to make this easy for her. After a moment, she took a shaky breath and started talking. She told me everything, the way things had started with Matt, how it had felt new and exciting, and how she'd convinced herself it was harmless, just a fling she could leave behind whenever she wanted. But as the months went on, it had spiraled out of control, becoming something darker, something she couldn't walk away from, even though she wanted to. It was like an escape, she said, her voice cracking. I felt trapped in this routine, like I was losing myself, and he made me feel alive again. But it wasn't real, Mark. It was just a fantasy, and I know now that it wasn't worth losing you. I listened, each word feeling like another blow. I wanted to scream, to tell her that if she felt trapped, she could have talked to me, that she could have chosen to work on things with me instead of running to someone else. But the anger was so intense, I couldn't speak. I just stared at her, wondering how I had never seen this side of her before. She took my silence as an invitation to keep talking, and she poured out every regret, every mistake, every broken promise. I could see the guilt weighing on her, the remorse in her eyes, and for a fleeting moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the pain she'd caused, the months of deceit, and any pity I felt was snuffed out like a flame. "What now, Sarah?" I asked finally, my voice cold. "What do you want from me?" She looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "I want to make this right. I know it'll take time, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to try. I want to rebuild what we had, if you'll let me." The words hung in the air, heavy with a hope I wasn't sure I shared. Part of me wanted to believe her, to cling to the idea that we could somehow mend the shattered pieces of our marriage. But another part of me knew that even if I wanted to forgive her, I might never be able to forget. And without trust, what kind of marriage would we have? I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my own uncertainty. "I don't know if I can do that, Sarah. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." She nodded, her face crumpling as tears spilled down her cheeks. "I understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I'm going to keep trying, even if it takes the rest of my life. I'll keep trying to show you that I'm sorry, that I can be the woman you fell in love with again." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that somehow, we could rebuild what we'd lost. But as I looked into her tear-streaked face, I felt the weight of doubt pressing down on me. Forgiveness seemed like an impossible mountain to climb, and I didn't know if I had the strength to even begin. After a long silence, I finally stood up, feeling a strange sense of finality settle over me. "I need time," I said, the words feeling heavy and hollow. "I need to figure out if there's anything left worth saving." She nodded, not saying a word, and as I walked out of that coffee shop, I felt a bittersweet relief wash over me. I didn't know what the future held, whether we'd find a way back to each other or if we'd go our separate ways. All I knew was that the life I'd known was over, and whatever came next would be something entirely new. And as painful as it was, I knew I had to face it, one day at a time. Chapter 6, New Realities. Days turned into weeks, and I was still grappling with the broken pieces of my life. The decision weighed on me, looming like an immovable shadow. I spent my days moving through routines on autopilot, my mind always circling back to the same questions, the same doubts. I'd stayed with Tom longer than I'd anticipated. He never pushed me, never offered advice unless I asked for it, but he was there when the silence became too much. I'd told him more about my struggles in those weeks than I'd told anyone. He knew my pain, my anger, and most importantly, he knew how conflicted I felt about the possibility of forgiving Sarah. "Man," he said one night over beers, "it's like you're walking on broken glass. And every step hurts. You're the only one who can decide if it's worth putting it all back together or moving on." I nodded, staring into my drink. I knew he was right, but no amount of advice could make the decision for me. I'd been loyal to Sarah for so long, my whole identity tied up in being her husband, in sharing our lives. The thought of letting that go, even after everything, felt like giving up a part of myself. Eventually, I decided to meet with a therapist. I hadn't considered therapy before, but the weight of my emotions was overwhelming, and I needed to understand what was best for me. Dr. Carter, a soft-spoken, gray-haired woman, had a way of listening that made me feel seen. She didn't judge or take sides, she simply helped me unravel the complicated mess inside my mind. "I want you to think about what forgiveness means to you," she said during one session. "Forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean reconciliation. It means letting go of the anger so you can find peace, whether you're with her or not." Her words stayed with me long after I left. Could I forgive Sarah without going back? Could I move on without bitterness eating me alive? For the first time, I started to consider a future that didn't include her, a path where I could rebuild my life, my own way. One day, Sarah sent a message that was different from the usual pleas and apologies. She asked if we could meet, not to talk about us, but to share something important. I hesitated, but something in her message sounded genuine, and I agreed to see her. We met at a park, a quiet place far from the city noise. When I arrived, she was sitting on a bench, looking worn but composed. She offered a small smile when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you for meeting me," she said. "I know it's hard, but I really needed to see you." I nodded, unsure of what to expect. She took a deep breath, fiddling with her hands before speaking. "I've been seeing a therapist. I've been trying to understand why I did what I did, why I hurt the person I loved most. I thought maybe if I could understand myself, I could start to make amends, not just to you, but to myself." Her words surprised me. I hadn't expected her to go to therapy, let alone tell me about it. She continued, her voice steady but raw. "I've realized I was running away from myself. I got lost in my own insecurities, in this need for validation that I never should have sought outside of our marriage. It's not an excuse, I know that, but I needed you to know I'm working on myself, even if we don't end up together." For a moment, I felt a strange sense of closure. Hearing her take responsibility, not just apologizing but truly understanding the harm she'd caused, felt like a release. The anger that had clung to me for weeks began to soften, replaced by a quieter sadness. I looked at her, realizing that as much as I'd loved her, as much as I'd trusted her, we'd both changed. And maybe that change was the only thing we had left. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "I know it couldn't have been easy to face all of that." She nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "I'm just sorry it took losing you to make me see what I'd become." We sat in silence for a while, watching as a family played nearby, their laughter echoing in the distance. I realized then that I could move on not because the pain was gone, but because I finally understood that holding on to anger would only keep me trapped in the past. When we stood to leave, Sarah reached out, her hand brushing mine. "If there's ever a way forward," she said, her voice trembling, "I'd do anything to make it right." I nodded, not making any promises. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I needed to find my own way, to build a life that was mine. In the weeks that followed, I slowly began to rebuild. I threw myself into work, reconnected with friends, and even took up running again. Each step forward felt like a small victory, a reminder that I could move on, that I was stronger than I'd realized. Dr. Carter helped me process my emotions, guiding me toward forgiveness, not just of Sarah, but of myself for ignoring the signs, for trusting blindly, for loving too hard without asking for what I needed in return. One evening, I found myself on the same beach where Sarah and I had once shared so many memories. The waves crashed against the shore, steady and constant, a reminder of life's inevitable tides. And as I stood there, feeling the cool sand beneath my feet, I realized I was ready to let go. The love I'd shared with Sarah would always be a part of me, a chapter in my life that had shaped who I was. But it was time to turn the page, to let the past stay where it belonged, and to find my own path forward. With a final look at the ocean, I took a deep breath, feeling a strange, newfound peace settle over me. Whatever lay ahead, I knew I could face it, one step at a time. Chapter 7, A New Beginning. The months that followed brought a quiet solitude that felt both strange and liberating. For the first time in years, I was living on my own terms, free from the weight of expectations or the compromises of marriage. There were days when the loneliness stung a pang of longing when I passed a couple holding hands, a hollow ache when I'd come home to an empty apartment. But with time, those moments became fewer, replaced by a growing sense of purpose, a sense of rebuilding. My therapist, Dr. Carter, encouraged me to explore the parts of myself I'd set aside, the passions and interests I'd let fade over the years. It was strange at first, trying to rediscover pieces of myself I hadn't acknowledged in so long. But I found small joys, things I'd forgotten how much I loved. I started running regularly, a habit I'd picked up briefly in college but had dropped when life got busy. Every morning, as I hit the trail, I found a strange comfort in the rhythm of my footsteps, the pounding of my heart, the steady inhale and exhale of my breath. With each mile, I felt my burdens lighten, my mind clearing with every step. Running became my therapy, my time to think or sometimes not to think at all, just to exist in the moment. One morning, as I finished my usual route, I noticed someone running just a few steps behind me. I turned to see a woman about my age, giving me a quick, friendly nod as she slowed down to catch her breath. "Hey," she said, flashing a smile. "You run here often?" "Yeah, most mornings," I replied, a little out of breath myself. "Me too. Surprised we haven't crossed paths before." She introduced herself as Emily, a teacher at a nearby high school. We started chatting, first about running, then about everything from books to travel to our favorite spots in the city. She was easygoing, her laugh light and genuine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something spark a tiny flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still room in my life for connection. After that, Emily and I started running together regularly. At first, we kept it casual, meeting up at the trail and chatting between breaths. But soon, we began lingering afterward, grabbing coffee, talking about our lives. She listened without judgment as I opened up about my failed marriage, about the betrayal and the pain I was still working through. She shared her own story, a long-term relationship that hadn't worked out, the lessons she'd learned, the strength she'd found in starting over. Our runs became something I looked forward to, a highlight in my otherwise quiet routine. Emily was kind and open, never pressing me to be more than I was ready for, and I found myself appreciating her companionship in a way I hadn't expected. She was helping me heal, not by trying to replace what I'd lost, but by being a reminder that life could still hold beauty and joy, even after heartbreak. Dash. As the months wore on, I continued to rebuild. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects and pushing myself to grow in ways I hadn't before. My career had always been important to me, but with the newfound clarity, I found myself taking risks, seeking out opportunities one might have overlooked in the past. And with each new challenge, I felt my confidence returning, a sense of resilience that I hadn't known I possessed. Sarah and I remained in touch, though our conversations were brief and infrequent. We had both moved on in our own ways, each of us finding our own paths forward. She was still seeing her therapist, still working on her own journey, and while I no longer felt the same bitterness I once had, I knew we were better off apart. We had both changed, and the love we'd once shared had become something distant, a memory that was no longer painful, but no longer a part of who we were. One evening, after a long day at work, I found myself at the coffee shop where Emily and I had often gone after our runs. She was there, waiting with a smile that lit up her face, and as we sat down, I felt a sense of calm settle over me, a feeling I hadn't known I'd been searching for. We talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories and laughter, the weight of the past no longer casting its shadow. And as I looked at her, I felt something shift within me, a gentle warmth, a glimmer of something new and precious, fragile yet real. "I'm glad we met," I said quietly, the words coming out softer than I'd intended. She looked at me, her eyes warm. "Me too." It wasn't a grand declaration, but it didn't need to be. For the first time, I felt a sense of peace, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Dash. Epilogue. As time went on, I found myself growing stronger, my heart healing in ways I hadn't thought possible. I was no longer defined by the pain of betrayal, no longer shackled to the anger and hurt that had once consumed me. I was living for myself, finding happiness in small moments, in new friendships, in rediscovering passions I'd forgotten. Emily and I continued to build our connection slowly, each of us careful, each of us carrying our own scars. We weren't rushing into anything, and I appreciated that about her. She understood the importance of healing, of allowing things to unfold naturally. One evening, as we watched the sunset from a hill overlooking the city, she reached for my hand, her fingers intertwining with mine. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. In that moment, I knew I had found something I hadn't dared to hope for, a new beginning, a chance to build something true and lasting, not as a replacement for what I'd lost, but as a testament to the resilience I'd found within myself. Life had taken me down a path I hadn't expected, a journey marked by heartbreak and healing. But standing there, hand in hand with Emily, I realized that I was grateful for the lessons, for the growth, for the love that had broken me and the love that had helped me rise. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I felt a quiet joy settle within me. This was my life, my new beginning, and I was finally ready to embrace it, one day at a time. Chapter 8, Finding Myself Again. In the months that followed, I started to notice a deeper change within myself. I was no longer just surviving, I was beginning to thrive. I'd spent so much time feeling like a victim of my circumstances, allowing Sarah's betrayal to define who I was. But with each day, I felt more in control, more at peace with my past, and more excited about my future. Emily and I continued to see each other, our connection growing stronger with each passing week. But the relationship was different than any I'd experienced before. We were both cautious, both respectful of the fact that we'd been through heartbreak, and both mindful of the importance of our own personal growth. Instead of rushing into anything, we allowed ourselves to be honest, open, and intentional. One weekend, Emily suggested we take a short trip out of town, a little getaway to a cabin by a lake a few hours away. I hadn't been on a trip that wasn't work-related in ages, and the idea of spending time in nature, away from the noise and distractions of everyday life, sounded perfect. The cabin was small and cozy, nestled in a quiet grove of trees that bordered a serene lake. The air was crisp and fresh, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves providing a peaceful backdrop. We spent the days hiking and exploring, and in the evenings, we'd sit by the fire, wrapped in blankets, talking for hours. One night, as we sat watching the stars, I found myself opening up to her in ways I hadn't with anyone else. "I think I lost myself somewhere along the way," I admitted. "In my marriage, in the routine, in all the expectations. I forgot who I was." Emily listened quietly, her hand warm in mine. "It's easy to lose ourselves when we're so focused on others," she said softly. "But sometimes, that's when we find our way back after everything falls apart." I looked at her, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the kindness and understanding she offered so freely. She didn't just accept my scars, she saw them, acknowledged them, and helped me see them as proof of my resilience. As I lay there beside her, under the vast expanse of stars, I felt something shift within me, a quiet confidence, a sense that I was exactly where I was meant to be. I realized that my journey was no longer about Sarah, or even about the pain I'd endured. It was about me, about rediscovering my strength, my passions, my sense of purpose. Back in the city, I threw myself even further into my own growth. I signed up for classes, workshops, and events that interested me. I took up photography, something I'd always wanted to try, and spent weekends exploring the city with my camera, capturing moments I'd once overlooked. One day, as I was reviewing some of my photos, Emily looked over my shoulder, smiling. "These are beautiful," she said. "You have an eye for capturing life as it is." Her words meant more to me than she knew. Photography had become a way for me to reconnect with myself, to see the world through a new lens. It was a reminder that beauty could be found in the simplest moments, that even in the midst of change, there was something worth holding onto. And in those small moments of creativity and exploration, I felt myself healing. It was a different kind of healing, one that wasn't just about moving on from the past, but about reclaiming my sense of self, my passions, my joy. One evening, as Emily and I prepared dinner together in my kitchen, she asked me something that took me by surprise. "Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive Sarah?" she asked gently, her tone devoid of judgment. I paused, considering her question. For a long time, forgiveness had felt like an impossible task, a burden I wasn't ready to shoulder. But as I stood there, surrounded by the life I was building, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about condoning her actions. It was about freeing myself from the weight of resentment, allowing myself to fully let go. "I think I'm getting there," I replied slowly. "It's not something that happens overnight. But I'm realizing that holding on to anger doesn't serve me anymore. Forgiveness, for me, is about finding peace within myself, and I think I'm closer to that than I've ever been." Emily nodded, giving my hand a gentle squeeze. She understood, without needing more explanation, that forgiveness was part of my journey forward, a way to let go of the past so I could fully embrace the future. Over time, the memories of Sarah became less painful, like faded pages in an old book. I no longer felt the sting of betrayal, no longer replayed the past in my head. Instead, I focused on the present, on my work, my friendships, my newfound hobbies, and the relationship with Emily that had become a source of comfort and joy. One night, as I sat with her by my side, I realized something profound: I was happy. Not just content, not just okay, but truly happy. I was no longer defined by the hurt I'd endured, but by the resilience I'd found. And as I looked at the life I was creating, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons, for the growth, for the strength that had carried me through. My story with Sarah had ended, but a new chapter had begun, a chapter filled with possibility, with self-discovery, with a love that felt real and true. And as I looked forward, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready to face it. Because, For the first time in a long time, I was whole, and I was exactly where I was meant to be.